Well, hello, students. This is Professor Levy, and once again, it is a pleasure to be back in the classroom. What I'm going to do today is record this lecture uh, describing what life was like for African Americans from the end of the Civil War, the period called Reconstruction, through the early part of the 20th century, ending with the career of Booker T. Washington. So I hope it feels like being in the classroom for you and that you could watch this presentation much like you would if you were on the campus of Northampton Community College, including asking questions and engaging in discussion, particularly in our Blackboard discussion room, and of course, questions through both to me and to your classmates. And I have some questions for you that I'll be asking through the presentation and also as an assignment for this week's lecture. So let's get started. It is commonly called Reconstruction. And as you can tell from the word reconstruct, meaning to put something back together, to reconstruct it. And so this is the period after a long and bloody civil war where the country was wondering, could it ever become united again? And if so, how would it be arranged? And so in this period, as the period we just finished on the Civil War, our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, played a pivotal role because he determined that the country was not going to be the same, that after this war, things would be different. And so he insisted on things like the end of slavery, which he initiated first with the Emancipation Proclamation back in 1863. But after the war was over, and then when I say after, I mean just really a few days after the war was over, the question of the legality of the Emancipation Proclamation became serious. That is, was it legal for Lincoln to do what he did in emancipating the slaves? And so this is why Republicans who supported Lincoln wanted to push for an amendment to the Constitution. The difference between the Emancipation Proclamation, which is merely an executive order, it is not a law passed by Congress, it's merely an executive order issued by the president, is that all executive orders are limited. They only have force while that president is in office, which really makes us think because Lincoln would be assassinated just a few weeks into his second term as president. So the legality of the Emancipation Proclamation might have evaporated immediately upon his assassination. So this is why, Lincoln's decision and his leadership, most importantly, was significant. We talked in earlier lectures about his background and about his evolution of thought up until this point. But what I want to call your attention to in this slide is the picture of Richmond, Virginia that you see here in the lower right-hand corner. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. And that's what it looked like at the end of the Civil War, like a bombed-out city in Germany after World War II. This is what Americans had done to other Americans for 4 years, costing the lives of over 600,000 American soldiers on both sides. And so the question of whether this country could ever become one again was a serious question. This was Lincoln's plan. Lincoln was trying to take a moderate position between the radical Republicans, people like Thaddeus Stevens, who we'll be talking about in a moment, and Democrats who wanted things to go back to the way they were, that the South had lost, but that nothing else should change. And so Lincoln says in his second inaugural address, which I think I have as a document for you to read, this is a very important speech that you should study in its entirety. It's not very long, but it's very important, in which Lincoln lays out his vision for a second term. And one of the things he says there, point number 2, is a quote from the speech where he says he wants to bind up the nation's wounds. That is, he really wants to try to heal this country if possible. And so he is willing to readmit, that is, to allow Confederate states back into the Union, if after 10% of the citizens of that state have taken an oath of loyalty to the United States. That is, he considered them all to be in a state of rebellion against the United States. Technically, this could be treason. And Lincoln was willing to admit them back if 10% of them had taken an oath of loyalty to accept the Constitution and Lincoln as president once again and to come back. I think it's also important to note that in that speech, Lincoln clearly says that the reason for this war was slavery. And this is important today when people debate about states' rights and other causes. Lincoln himself said in his second inaugural address in 1865 that this war was really all about slavery. And he also announced his support for what would become the 13th and later the 14th Amendment. And he said that he supported the 13th Amendment, of course, and slavery, but the 14th and 15th Amendments, which make African American citizens and also would give some of them the right to vote, Lincoln said that he supported giving the right to vote to some African Americans. And particularly, he qualified by that by saying those who are very intelligent. And so Lincoln's attitudes, if you recall, back to his run for the United States Senate in 1857, in which Lincoln said, although I'm opposed to slavery, I do not believe that black people should be allowed to hold office. I do not believe black people should be allowed to vote. Lincoln announces in 1865 that he's changed his position, and now he does believe that some black people are intelligent enough to vote. And he also said that those who have served bravely in the Civil War have earned the right to be American citizens. And here he's talking about the African American soldiers who by the end of the war made up 10% of the Union Army and really distinguished themselves in service. And so by this point, he's in favor of allowing some black people to vote. Individuals such as Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, a congressman, and Charles Sumner, the senator from Massachusetts, they are called radical Republicans. And what's so radical about them is they wanted to go even further than Lincoln was willing to go. They wanted to confiscate the land owned by these previous slave owners in the South and redistribute that land to newly freed black people. This would be really reconstructing the South and giving black people land that they can work and wealth that they would own and could pass on to future generations. We would see this represented in what would be called 40 acres and a mule, but that was never a law, but there were people, radical Republicans, who wanted to make this a law. They also disagreed with Lincoln in that they wanted to raise the threshold to 50% before a Confederate state could be readmitted back into the Union. Lincoln's positions is probably what led to his assassination by John Wilkes Booth on April 14th, 1865. And that's what's depicted here in this slide. John Wilkes Booth was obviously a Confederate sympathizer, and he heard what Lincoln wanted to do, that in his second term he wasn't just going to stop with freeing the slaves, but he was going to go further, that he was going to make black people citizens of the United States, that he was going to give black people the right to vote. And so John Wilkes Booth and his associates changed their plan, which originally had been to merely kidnap Lincoln and hold him ransom and try to negotiate a settlement with the North. Now their position was Lincoln must be killed. Lincoln must die. And it's important to note that Robert E. Lee, the leading general of the Confederate Army, had already surrendered on April 9th. So the Civil War is really over. The South had already lost. So the question is, why would John Wilkes Booth assassinate Lincoln now when his assassination will not change the outcome of the war? In other words, the South has already lost. They have already surrendered. What John Wilkes Booth hoped to accomplish by assassinating Lincoln is that he would stop Lincoln from implementing his plans to make black people citizens of the United States and to give them the right to vote. With Lincoln's assassination, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, became the 17th president. This is a picture of Andrew Johnson here on the screen. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat, not a Republican like Lincoln. He was a racist. He was put on the ticket as a gesture to the South that Lincoln was going to try to be inclusive in his second term, because Johnson wasn't his vice president in his first term, but this was a gesture to the South that Lincoln would be inclusive and he would have Southerners in his cabinet, he would have Democrats in his cabinet, and so he put Andrew Johnson on the ticket. Also because Johnson, although he was a Democrat, he did not secede with the rest of his state from Tennessee. He thought secession was illegal and unwise, but he sympathized with the Southern position. No one expected Johnson to actually become president. But when Lincoln was assassinated, then Johnson did become president, and his policies were almost completely opposite what Lincoln wanted to do. As a Democrat, Andrew Johnson's position was that we want the country the way it was, and we want to leave the Constitution the way it is, so that he did not support any of the constitutional amendments that were being passed at this time, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Andrew Johnson was opposed to those. He was opposed to keeping Union soldiers in the South. He was opposed to all the civil rights legislation that the Republicans in Congress were passing, and he would try to veto as many of them as he could. So Lincoln's assassination led to Johnson becoming president, and Johnson's opposition to civil rights turned out to be very significant. As I mentioned a moment ago, the 40 Acres and a Mule started as a executive order by General William Tecumseh Sherman, who gave this order to his army that was down in the South, occupying the area around South Carolina, where they would give each newly freed black family 40 acres and mules that the army no longer needed, and then they would be allowed to work that land, to own that land, and to support themselves. This gave them not only freedom, but self-sufficiency. And when Johnson became president, he revoked that order, ordered all of the black occupants off of that land, and returned it to their previous white owners. These three constitutional amendments are very important, and you need to know what they are and to memorize them. They will certainly be questions on your next exam. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution simply says that no person in the United States shall be held as a slave, except as punishment for a crime. So this ends slavery once and for all, permanently in America. And Abraham Lincoln signed that amendment. Constitutional amendments do not require presidential signature because it requires 2/3 of Congress and the Senate to approve it, and then it has to be approved by 2/3 of the states. So presidential signature or veto is superfluous. But Lincoln wanted his name on that 13th Amendment. That makes African Americans free. But if you recall, the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court in 1857 said that even if black people were free, they are not citizens of the United States. And so therefore the 14th Amendment defined what is citizenship. And it defines citizenship as any person born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. That is important because these 4 million slaves who were freed now by the 13th Amendment, they were all born in the United States. And therefore the 14th Amendment says anyone who's born in the United States is therefore a citizen of the United States. So now they are free and they are citizens. I want to point out that the wording of the 14th Amendment has implications today, because they could have said all African Americans are now citizens of the United States, or anyone who was previously a slave is now a citizen. But defining it as being dependent on your place of birth has implications today for immigrants to the United States. If a person comes to the United States, say they come illegally, if they're living here in the United States and they have children, and their children are born in the United States, then under the 14th Amendment, then those children are American citizens, because it doesn't matter where you're from, it doesn't matter who your parents are, what your legal status is. If you're born in the United States, you're a citizen of the United States. So that's another implication of the 14th Amendment. And finally, we have the 15th Amendment. And what the 15th Amendment says is that no state shall deny a person the right to vote because of their previous condition of servitude or because of their race. This effectively gave black men the right to vote, but not black women. And when you think about it, it only restricts a state from passing a law saying no black person can vote. So because voting is a state exercise, they anticipated that many southern states would pass laws saying in the state of Mississippi, black people are not allowed to vote, or in the state of Alabama, black people are not allowed to vote. And so the 15th Amendment prohibits states from passing laws that would deny a person the right to vote because of their race. And we'll see in a moment how they try to get around the 15th Amendment by, other laws, literacy tests and grandfather clauses and things like that, poll taxes. But they cannot just simply pass a law saying black people can't vote, the way they would for, say, using public buses or bathrooms, just simply denying a person because of their race. They could not do that. But because this is you cannot deny a person because of their race or previous condition of servitude, it said nothing about gender or sex. And this was not a mistake, because the leading white feminists of the period, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, the black abolitionist, Harriet Tubman, another black abolitionist, they were all in favor of adding the word race or sex to the 15th Amendment, saying you cannot deny a person the right to vote because of their race, nor can you deny them the right to vote because of their sex. But the men in Congress refused to put the word sex in the 15th Amendment, which made it permissible for states to continue to deny women the right to vote. And that would remain the case until 1920 with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And what the 19th Amendment says is no state shall deny a person the right to vote because of their gender or sex. That won't become the law until the 1920s. These people wanted this put into law during the Reconstruction period, but they did not include that in the 15th Amendment. So, therefore, black men had the right to vote, but black women did not. And that's what I explained here. Now, even though technically they have the right to vote, if you look at this slide, you see a cartoon which accurately depicts what it was like for black people who tried to exercise their right to vote. And so if you showed up on election day at a polling place, you could be subject to threats, to intimidation, retaliation in the form of members of the Ku Klux Klan or hostile groups, showing up at your home, burning a cross on your lawn, and an increase in lynching. Voting was not as private as it is today. They would often have a box for the Democratic Party and a box for the Republican Party, and people would put their ballots into one of these boxes. Because so many people were illiterate, black and white, they would put symbols on the box. So the donkey represented the Democratic Party, and the Republican was represented by the elephant for people who could not read the words Democrat or Republican. And so what Southerners noted is that black people would overwhelmingly vote for the Republican Party. This was because it was the Republican Party of the North that supported the Civil War. It was the Republican Party and Republicans like Abraham Lincoln who passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And so therefore black people were loyal to the Republican Party. Southern states, as soon as getting their rights back, began to pass laws restricting the activity of free black people. These laws are collectively known as Jim Crow laws. A crow is a black bird, so Jim Crow laws basically mean laws against black people. This is also the period of stereotypical plays called minstrel shows, and often the person in those shows, the black person, would be a person called Jim, and so this is another derogatory term. And it was also a dance called Jim Crow, which mocked black people. And so these Jim Crow laws included such things as imposing literacy tests, which meant that before a person had the right to vote, they had to pass a test to prove not only that they could read and write, but also that they understood the Constitution, or they could also include very abstract, obscure, trivial questions designed to prevent black people from passing those exams so that they could not vote. They could also be very subjective, that is, they're based on the person administering the exam to determine whether a person passed or not, and they could be very biased and unfair. Some questioners would ask potential black voters questions like, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Or show them a jar and say, how many jelly beans or how many marbles in this jar? And if you couldn't answer that correctly, then they could say you didn't pass the test. I mean, these are some perhaps apocryphal stories, but what is true is that these literacy tests effectively prevented the majority of black population from voting because they weren't given any educational opportunity before the Civil War. In addition to that, they would require that a tax be paid. That's called a poll tax. You see here on the slide. Because people were poor, the requirement to pay a fee would also discourage them from voting because it also cost money that they didn't have. Now, these two things, the literacy test and the poll tax, had unexpected consequences. By unexpected, I mean that it also had the effect of preventing a large number of white voters from voting because the South had a very high level of white illiteracy. And so if they had to pass a test, many of the white voters who were poor and did not attend any public schools, which there were no public schools in the South before the Civil War, so they would be illiterate and unable to pass the test. And also the poll tax would discourage poor white people from voting for the same reason. And so they came up with a very clever mechanism called the grandfather clause. That's the next point on the slide. The reason it's called the grandfather clause is what it said was, if your grandfather was allowed to vote, then you would also be allowed to vote in that county or in that state. And so this provided them with an exemption, even if they couldn't pass the test or pay the poll tax. Whereas for black citizens, they would not be able to claim that their grandfathers were allowed to vote because, obviously, their grandfathers would have been slaves or would have been free black people who could not vote in that state. So now these laws effectively allow poor and illiterate white voters to cast a ballot, but denied poor and illiterate black voters from voting. And so that became the law. And segregation in public accommodations, from bathrooms to restaurants to horse-drawn carriages and later to trains and buses, would become the norm throughout much of the South. We already defined the grandfather clause, so we'll skip that slide, and how this became the law throughout much of the South. There was some progress made, though, for African Americans, particularly in that brief period when black people had the right to vote and many white Southerners had not been re-enfranchised, that is, their states had not been allowed back into the Union, and when the Republican Party and Union soldiers still occupied the South. And in those areas, black people did vote for a while. And when they were allowed to vote, they would elect black congressmen and even senators as often as they could. And so between 1868 and 1873, there were at least 14 black congressmen for the first time, black congressmen in the United States Congress, and 2 black senators, both representing southern states, both in this case representing the state of Mississippi, of all places. Here's a lithograph of some of these first black elected congressmen. And here are portraits of, actually photographs of Hiram Revel and Blanche Bruce, who were the first black senators, both representing the state of Mississippi. As a thought question, I wanted to ask you, how many black senators are there today? Think about that. And then you see how significant it was for there to be such a large number of black congressmen and black senators back in the 19th century. Now, in 1896, we have a very important Supreme Court case called the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. Hopefully you read about this in your textbook, and I'll explain it here briefly. The facts in the Plessy versus Ferguson case are these. Homer Plessy was a black man, a very light-skinned black man. We think this is a likeness of him in this photograph, although this picture has been disputed, and it could very well be a picture of the Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana, PBS Pinchback, who was also a very light-skinned black man. But he was so light, we know, and this is important to the story, that he could often pass for white, as many black people could and did. And to test the segregation laws, the story is that he was bought a ticket to ride a train in Louisiana, in the state of Louisiana. And as the conductor went through the car, his name was Ferguson, that's why it's called Plessy versus Ferguson. As the conductor went through the car, he asked to see his ticket of Homer Plessy, and he looked at Mr. Plessy and he told him, "You have to sit in the Negro car." Even though he purchased a first-class ticket, he had to sit in a segregated, blacks-only section of the train. And so Homer Plessy fought his case all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that these segregation laws were a violation of his 14th Amendment rights. Remember, the 14th Amendment says that anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. It also says that all American citizens are entitled to equal protection under the law. Equal protection under the law, meaning, in theory, all Americans should be treated the same. And so he argued that these segregation laws was a violation of the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection to all Americans. Well, the Supreme Court heard that case, and in an 8-1 decision, they ruled that segregation laws are not a violation of the 14th Amendment. In other words, that these segregation laws are legal. Plessy also argued in that case that the laws were unfair, not only because they violated the 14th Amendment, but they were unfair to people like him who were more white than they were black. I believe he argued that he was only 1/16 black. But under the one-drop rule, if you have any visible African ancestry, you are 100% black in the United States. And he said that that law was unfair. Perhaps this is because Louisiana, when it was a French territory until 1803, the French had different laws in different categories. So not just black and white, but they had mulatto, which means, mixed race people had greater privileges, but not so under the United States. And the Supreme Court ruled in an 8-1 decision. Now, there was one notable dissenter in that case who said that this law was unfair. But it was an 8-1 decision, and it established the policy of what was called separate but equal. That's an important term. You should write it down. It is in my presentation, meaning segregation laws are permissible as long as the facilities that they offer the black customers are equal. And so that they are allowed to travel on the train and get to the same destination as the other passengers. So they argue that that's being equal. And as long as the facilities are equal, they can be separate. Now, in fact, often the conditions in the black car or the black section were inferior, but that's what the law said. And that's what the decision in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision was all about. Okay, I'm going to go a little faster here. There's a lot of things on these slides, but I think you'll get the picture. In addition to the legal laws that were being passed, these Jim Crow laws, there's also something called social etiquette. Etiquette relates to the rules of manners, how you're supposed to behave. Now, there's a racial etiquette that people had to know and follow in the South. These weren't laws that were written down any place, but they were understood and followed. And if you did not follow them, there could be serious consequences. Some of these racial etiquette rules are things like this. Black and white people do not shake hands. So if you met a white person, you're not supposed to put your hand out to shake hands. This is something that people who are equals do. Black people do not look directly into white people's eyes when they're talking to them. So if you're talking to a white person, you're supposed to look down at your feet, but not look them directly into the eye. That would be considered a sign of equality, a sign of mutual respect when you look a person in the eye when you talk to them. Black people were supposed to remove their hats when they're in the presence of white people in their homes or talking to them. You're supposed to take your hat off as a sign of respect. But white people do not have to remove their hats when speaking to black people. If you had to go to a white person's home for some reason, then you were supposed to go to the back door, not to the front door. The front door is reserved for guests and friends. So black people go to the back. Black men or boys must never look at white women. This was called reckless eyeballing, and just merely looking at a white woman in any particular way could be dangerous to black men. Black women could not try on clothing in stores, in white-owned stores. So they may be able to shop, but they couldn't try on hats, clothing, shoes, and they couldn't return those items if they did not fit. And white people did not use titles of respect when speaking to black people. And what do I mean by titles of respect? Like referring to them as Mr. or Mrs. or ma'am. These are considered titles of respect, and they did not use those titles when talking to black people. And the last example that I have here is white customers were always served first. So if you were in a store with black and white customers and there was a line, if there were a white person online standing behind a black person, the clerk would take the white person first, and as a sign of privilege that they didn't have to wait online behind black people. And these were examples of social etiquette of the period. One of the most common occupations for black men in particular during Reconstruction into the 20th century was working on trains as Pullman porters. Pullman was the largest excuse me, company. But this was a very civilized way of traveling. These trains had sleeping cars where you could sleep on the train. They had dining cars where you could have meals, lounge cars where you could drink and smoke cigars. And the porters would care for you, almost like butlers, on a train. And these were fairly good jobs for black people at the time. And black men dominated that occupation for a long time. Some black people at the end of the Civil War chose to leave the South and move out west. This is the period of westward expansion, and much of the land we had taken from Mexico during the Mexican-American War was being allotted to white citizens, where you would go there and you could stake a claim. The government would essentially give you land for free or for very minimal fees to get large quantities of land in what was called the Homestead Act. That was the law that distributed millions of acres of land that previously belonged to Indians and to Mexico to American citizens. Some black free people thought that they would go out west and get land as well. And they became known as exodusters. The pun is Exodus, like the book of the Bible, Exodus, going out of Egypt, except here they're going out of the South and they're going out west, and they are trying to get some land. And in some cases they did. They established not only land for themselves, but established entire black communities, black cities and towns in Kansas and in Nebraska. And these were black towns with black mayors and sheriffs. And some black people did go out and to try to get some land in the West. But most black people stayed in the South and became sharecroppers. And here I'm going to define what it meant to be a sharecropper. A sharecropper, as the term implies there, are people who got a share of the profits. So they didn't own the land. White people would own the land. Black people would work the land. But at the end of the season, they were promised a share of the profits if there were any profits from that year. The deal could be something like the owner got to keep 60% and he shared 40% with the workers, or it could be as bad as where the owner kept 75% and only gave 25% to the workers. This meant that the black people who worked on this land, one, they didn't own the land, which meant they had nothing to pass on to their children. And secondly, they had to live in debt for most of the year because they weren't being paid every week or every 2 weeks, or even every month. They would get a share when the crop came in. So how they survived between the time of planting and the time the crop was sold was on credit. These weren't credit cards, but this would be a line of credit that the master would allow at a local store, either his own store if he owned it, or the nearby store that black people could go, and they can buy things on credit at very high prices with very high interest rates. And so this meant that they were constantly in debt. That debt had to be paid out of their share of the profits. So once the crop was sold, before they got the money, they would deduct all that they owed from the previous year. And sometimes there wouldn't be anything left over for them to live on in the next year, so they would have to borrow again. And so they lived in debt. And this is how most black people who stayed in the South for the next few generations worked as sharecroppers. There were also many white sharecroppers, so it wasn't just black people, but it was something that poor farmers did, and there was no future in that, and just led to prolonged debt. Now, in 1895, Frederick Douglass died, and the next great black leader of the 19th century was the person you see on the slide here. His name was Booker T. Washington. And I said this lecture covers from the period of the end of the Civil War to the 20th century and the age of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington, to say a few things about him briefly, he was born a slave in 1856, which means that he was only a child during slavery. He was the product of a black woman and a white man. He never knew who his father was, and he worked menial jobs as a young man. But in 1872, he enrolled at one of these new colleges created for black students in Virginia called Hampton Institute. And there he studied. He was very poor, so he worked his way through college by taking classes during the day and working as one of the janitors at the college at night. So he would sit in the classroom during the day and then clean the classrooms at night. And that's the way he worked his way through college. That's how determined he was to get an education. And he did so well that they invited him to stay on as an instructor after he graduated. And then in 1881, he became the president of a newly found black college in Alabama called Tuskegee Institute. And this would be one of America's premier black colleges, and he would become one of America's leading black figures. And he would make his reputation in 1895 at a cotton exposition. And when I say cotton exposition, it wasn't about cotton. It was like the World's Fair. And they would show off new inventions, and there would be political speeches. And he spoke, and he gave a speech there. And I have a quote for you to look at here on the screen, where he said, "In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in things essential for mutual progress." I want you to think about that metaphor. So he's using the hand as a metaphor for social relations. And he says when it comes to social things, black and white people can be separate, which is what they are, segregated. Black communities, white communities. And he says in those social things, that separation can continue. But in things that are essential for mutual progress, they should be one. What kind of things do you think he meant as essential for mutual progress? Here he's talking about economic activity, business, right? And social things like eating and socializing, they could be separate. But when it comes to business, they should work together. And this opinion was very popular in the South. It gained him applause and support from leading white philanthropists, people like Andrew Carnegie, the Rosenwald Foundation, those philanthropists who gave money to Tuskegee and to his operation in support of this two-path system where one path socially would be segregated, but there would be economic opportunity created for black people. And this was the motto of Tuskegee Institute. Here's a picture of Tuskegee. Here you see students. And I really want students to look at this classroom. And I would ask you to describe what you see. What do you think of the students and the teachers? This picture was probably taken, the caption says here, in 1902. And other than, the fact they don't have computers, I want you to take note of how well dressed the students were. That they were proud to be college students. As they walked around Atlanta, people would be able to identify them on the street and say, there goes a Tuskegee student. And how did they know that they were college students? Because of the way that they were dressed. The women wore these nice long dresses. The men wore suits and ties. And so they were obviously not sharecroppers. And they were obviously not slaves like their parents. And so Tuskegee represented, educational opportunity for black people. In addition to Tuskegee, I have a list of some of the other black colleges that were created during this period. Places like Hampton Institute, where Booker T. Washington attended, Fisk University in Tennessee, Tougaloo College, Lincoln Institute here in Pennsylvania, Morehouse College in Atlanta, Howard University in Washington, D.C. These were some of the black colleges that were created during this period. The role of the black church has always been important in African American history. And in the period of Reconstruction, the black church was the strongest independent black institution. The largest black denominations were the Baptist Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You also had the rise of the holiness of Pentecostal movements that began around the end of the 19th century. And these holiness evangelical Pentecostal movements began during this period. Many sociologists have argued that the worship services during this time, which focused on music and inspirational sermons with a lot of interaction between the ministers and the congregation, dancing and chanting, that these services not only offered enjoyment, but some have argued provided solace, that is peace, from oppression and the opportunity to escape momentarily the harshness of the political reality in which black people lived. And so there is a debate about whether the black church was a good thing or a bad thing, that it allowed black people to escape from reality, that it was, kind of an emotional release, but it was not very political. Although most of the political leaders did come out of the church, were ministers and reverends through to almost to the present. I mean, people like Dr. Martin Luther King and Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton. The black church has produced a lot of black leaders throughout its history, but as a whole, the black church was not very political in the 19th century. One notable exception is the person that you see here on the screen. His name was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, and he was a bishop in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He was a radical in the sense that he supported black people perhaps moving to Africa long before Marcus Garvey in the 1920s. And he also advocated a kind of radical theology. He argued that God is a Negro, that these people in the Bible, if they lived today, would be considered black and not white. And so this kind of like theological interpretation of the Bible was both new and radical for its time. And that was Bishop Henry McNeil Turner. He was a black nationalist. He supported civil rights. He supported black people voting. And he was an exception to the generally non-political black church and leadership of the period. If we look at black soldiers after the Civil War, many of them became known as Buffalo Soldiers. There's a popular Bob Marley song called Buffalo Soldier, Dreadlock Rasta. And the term Buffalo Soldier was coined by Cheyenne and Comanche Indians out west. So after the Civil War, as settlers went back out west to claim land, and Indians were often forced onto reservations, the Indians would sometimes fight back, and the American government would send in the army. And black soldiers were some of those soldiers used to fight the Indians. And the Indians referred to the black soldiers as Buffalo Soldiers because their hair reminded them of the hair of the buffalo, which were sacred animals to these Western tribes. And so that's how they got the nickname Buffalo Soldiers. Later, they would fight in the Spanish-American War, and they would go to Cuba and to Puerto Rico. They would often be used also throughout the Caribbean and in Haiti in particular, and they even fought in the Philippines. And this is some of the ways in which black soldiers were used after the Civil War. They continued to fight in segregated units, not integrated into the larger army, but in these segregated units, and most of them had white officers in charge of these black regiments. As he comes to the conclusion of this lecture, I want to point out some other important things that happened during this period. Here you see a photograph of Madam C.J. Walker riding in one of her luxury cars. And you've probably heard of her before, but Madam C.J. Walker was America's first self-made female millionaire, black or white, the first woman to become a self-made millionaire. And she made her fortune selling hair care products, particularly to women. She owned her own factory, producing the product. She owned beauty parlors around the country, a chain of stores. And she became a major philanthropist, donating a lot of her money to charities, to Booker T. Washington, who we just talked about, to the NAACP, and to women's groups. And so Madam C.J. Walker was an important figure during her time, and the first black self-made millionaire. Here you see a chart taken from your textbook showing the increase in lynching that took place after the Civil War and continued at high levels up until the 1930s. Here's a picture of an actual lynching, and it is estimated that between 1882 and 1930, at least 2,805 people in 10 southern states were lynched. That works out to about one black man, woman, or child was murdered nearly once a week, every week, between 1832 and 1930. So these hate-driven crimes, these lynchings, were very frequent. They were happening on average every week. Black people were being lynched throughout the South. These pictures are very graphic and moving, but they illustrate the one I have on the screen now. What strikes me about this lynching is he was lynched and then burned. But look at the size of the crowd. I mean, it must be hundreds of people standing around in broad daylight while this crime is being perpetrated. This is not, a person who was tried in a court of law and then convicted and put in an electric chair. These would be mobs that would capture black people who are often innocent and lynch them in this public manner. Here is a slide showing a lynching, and can you guess what this picture is? Can you tell from the borders? This was a postcard that people could buy and mail as souvenirs. So, if you were like in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, you could send a postcard home to your family saying, "Hi, I'm in Myrtle Beach," or "I'm in Florida," or "I'm in Texas, and here's a picture of a lynching." And people would see these and save these as souvenirs. People who actually attended lynchings would sometimes take body parts back as souvenirs, fingers, ears, and keep those as souvenirs of the lynching. Finally, the way this period was remembered in popular culture, in the media, in books, and in movies tells us a lot about what people thought of this period. And I would like for you to watch clips of this film that I have in Blackboard. The most popular film of the time was called Birth of a Nation. This movie was based on a book by Thomas Dixon called The Klansman, about the Ku Klux Klan. It was the highest grossing film of its day. It made $10 million. That would be the equivalent of a $300 million Marvel blockbuster today. And it was filmed with white actors in blackface, and any scene in which there was a white woman, then they would put white actors and put black makeup on their faces. But it depicts the South during the period we've studied today as a lawless period in which white people lived in fear of black people, and the only thing that saved them was the Ku Klux Klan. They are the heroes. They literally come riding in on their horses, and they saved the South from domination and control of black people. They literally rescue white people from their homes that were being overrun and attacked by black people. They save white women who are being raped and chased by black men. There's one scene in the movie where they depict those black congressmen barefoot in Congress and drinking liquor and eating fried chicken, and the Ku Klux Klan will come in with their guns on their horses and intimidate black people from voting. And they show this in the movie. And this is to show how order was restored to the South. This was a popular movie in the North as well as the South. And it is believed that President Woodrow Wilson showed this film in the White House. And after he saw it, he said, quote, "It is like writing history with lightning." Now, of course, almost everything in that movie is a distortion of reality. What we just showed you is what life was really like for black people right after the Civil War. But history and memory are often two different things. Another popular movie that was made about the period of the Civil War and Reconstruction is called Gone with the Wind. Maybe you've seen it. It's a classic film. And it's like everything was great until the Civil War, and then all the beauty of the South was gone with the wind. And so they looked on the pre-Civil War period, the slave period, with nostalgia, with regret for what was lost, that things were better during slavery than they were after slavery. And that's how the country remembered this period of Reconstruction until very recently. Of course, we have a different view, a more realistic and accurate view of what our history was. Well, this concludes my lecture today. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. I hope I helped explain this to you. Of course, it's not a substitute for actually reading the assigned chapters, but I think that it helped give you some analysis, some understanding, and some critique. And so with that, I look forward to reading your comments in the discussion this week, and I look forward to seeing how well you do on this next exam, which will cover a lot of this material. Until then, take care, be well, and I hope you're enjoying the course.